Now you can hear me. We've handed out a slide deck, and we apologize for all the trees we killed in order that we could share all of this information with you. Let me get it open here on the screen. So let me thank you for inviting us to come and talk to you about the Georgia Lottery. I think the Georgia Lottery adds a lot of value to the state of Georgia, and we rarely have a public forum to tell our story. In this instance, it's in your best interest to understand the business of the Georgia Lottery, and it's in our best interest to tell you about the business of the Georgia Lottery. I want to tell you a little bit about me and why, hope and pre-K are so personal to me. I've had a lengthy career in state government, as many of you know. I was an assistant commissioner for the technical college system, a technical college president before going over to work for Governor Sonny Perdue and serve as his deputy budget director and eventually as his director of the Office of Planning and Budget. I had that distinct pleasure under Governor Deal as well. So personally, the reason hope is so important to me is I, like Senator Beach, had two children as a single parent who attended as Hope Scholars the University of Georgia, and I too learned to bark like a dog. So personally, it was a real benefit to my children because I encouraged them in high school to do well so that they could earn that Hope Scholarship. As a college president, I had many students who were first-generation college students as well, so I understood the value of hope, particularly the Hope Grant, to those students. At the Office of Planning and Budget, I participated on several study commissions, that were related to hope. Each one of those were very difficult as we looked at how to pare back hope to. I keep getting a. Let me see if I can do this a little bit better. As we looked at how to pare back hope to match where revenues and expenditures would match, very, very, very difficult decisions that the legislature had to make. I appreciate those because I was involved in those discussions. I know the pressures that you feel and that Georgia's families feel to grow, and for us at the Georgia Lottery to grow revenues for Hope and Pre-K. So I wanted you to understand my story, and I have a team with me today. Every member of my team has had a family member or themselves or a colleague or a neighbor utilize Hope and Pre-K. That is without fail with every Georgia Lottery Corporation employee. Everyone comes to work every single day determined to drive as many revenues to maximize profits to Hope and Pre-K. To talk to you a little bit about, and I forgot my social graces. Let me thank you, Senator Beach and Representative Ramsey, for inviting me here today. Thank you very much. So a little bit of history about the Georgia Lottery. Much of this you know because many of you were instrumental in passing this legislation many years ago. In November of 1992, the Georgia voters approved the constitutional amendment to create the Georgia Lottery Corporation. Our first ticket sales went on sale in June 29th, 1993. We were the 36th lottery. Today there are 44 plus DC. We are created as an instrumentality of the state as well as a public corporation by statute. All of our net proceeds are to support improvements and enhancements for educational purposes and programs, and that the net proceeds should be used to supplement, not supplant, existing educational funding. My GLC board is appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. We have 2 legislative oversight committees. The first one is House Regulated Industries, and the second is the Senate Economic Development Committee. We received no state appropriations. The Georgia Lottery Corporation was started with a loan that was repaid within, I believe, a week of operations. Currently, we operate at 10.5% of net revenues, and you'll see our financials a little later. We have one job: make money for Hope and Pre-K. And we send our profits quarterly over to the state treasury. We don't make any decisions with regard to how they get spent, nor do we manage that lottery for education account, and nor do we manage any of the reserves funds. We do not manage the statutory reserves, nor do we manage the excess reserves. And finally, in 2013, House Bill 487 transferred regulatory oversight of the coin-operated amusement machines over to the Georgia Lottery Corporation. Where does the money go? Well, let me talk about earnings. Every day, we earn about $2.7 million for Hope and Pre-K. To date, we've returned over $16.5 billion to Hope and Pre-K. More than 1.7 million students have received Hope, and more than 1.4 million 4-year-olds have attended lottery-funded pre-K programs. So what do those returns look like to get you to $16.5 billion? This is a big eye chart here. But what I really wanted to point out on this slide is that profits returned to Hope and Pre-K, to Lottery for Education account, have increased in all but 2 years, in 1998 and in 2011. Since 2011, when the Hope changes were made, deposits to Lottery for Education have increased by $135 million. So that means since 2011, since the Hope changes were made, we are returning $135 million more annually as of this last fiscal year. And let me show you. And this is what this looks like over the past 3 years. In FY14, and I put this up here because this is when we received the oversight responsibilities for coin-operated amusement machines. In FY14, we returned a total of $945,100,000 to Hope and Pre-K. Of that, $5 million came from COAM operations. In FY15, we returned almost $970 million from traditional lottery, and another approximately $11 million from the coin-operated amusement oversight responsibilities, for a total of $980,501,000. So almost $1 billion. But our big year is coming next year. We are budgeted for proceeds totaling $1 billion, $10 million to Hope and Pre-K. I want to talk about why rankings matter. I think Senator Beach alluded to this earlier. Rankings matter to me. They really, really matter. We got up this morning. They matter in my household. I'll tell you what mattered this morning when we got up. My husband checked the AP poll to see where Georgia and Georgia Tech ranked in football. Anybody know where that is? Anybody else check it this morning? Yes. Someone said 7th for Georgia. Well, I live with a Georgia Tech grad, so I know they're ranked 14th. He didn't agree with that poll, but they matter. I also have been keeping track of how Georgia fares in terms of the top 100 public universities. The rankings just came out from U.S. News and World Report. We had 3 universities rank in the top 100. Emory, Georgia Tech, and Georgia. Those matter. Those matter to those institutions. They matter to the state. We wanted you to know where the Georgia Lottery Corporation ranks. And my team knows that I watch these rankings, and we're doing everything we can to move our rankings because we know we represent the state of Georgia. So worldwide rankings, these come from LaFleur's 2015 World Lottery Almanac. Where do we rank worldwide? There are about about 200 lotteries globally. We rank 17th in total sales, 5th in total per cap sales, 10th in instant sales, and 2nd in instant per cap sales. And where do we rank nationally? We rank number 2 in per cap sales. We rank number 2 in instant per cap sales, and we rank number 4 in returns for beneficiaries. So how do we stack up? What does it look like? Here's a chart that kind of tells you about profit per capita, and that's really about how productive we are. If you'll look at these, the states that are ahead of us, Massachusetts and New York, New Jersey, we didn't have FY15 numbers. When they're in, we'll report those to you as well. We've tried to annotate it on this slide. But as you can see, Massachusetts and New York, they've been in operation for 43 and 48 years respectively. We've been in operation for 22 years. And I think that speaks to the professionalism and the success of the Georgia Lottery to be returning and this is traditional lottery alone, I've not included COAM in here, to be returning $96 per cap over and above many states that have been in operation quite many years, more than we have, with greater populations. Oops, I went the wrong way, sorry. So our year-over-year change. So looking at how did we grow year over year in terms of profit to the Lottery for Education account. Now, we returned 3.1% more incremental profit than we did in FY14. South Carolina returned 5.5% profit. But I want to point to you the level of returns. They didn't outrank us in profit per cap, and their returns are about a third of the Georgia Lottery returns as well. So a lower baseline number to benchmark against. But if you look at the other top profit per capita states, the most productive, successful states in the nation, you can compare our performance year over year to those states. Another way to look at it, so I'm going to let you look at it several different ways. It's just the dollar profit. How much dollars did we return to the state as compared to other lotteries? So the highest dollar return, New York at $2.2 billion, Florida, California, Texas, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and then Georgia. So we rank with these, in terms of dollar profit, 7th. Let me go back here and point out, though, look at the population of those states that have a higher dollar return compared to Georgia, with the exception of Massachusetts. So how do we compare on year-over-year incremental growth in lottery returns to education with those states who returned who ranked in the top 10 or 12 in dollar profit? I think we did pretty good last year. Southeast region, looking at our neighboring states, we ranked number 1 in terms of profit per capita and number 2 in dollars returned, only behind Florida. And again, our comparison of change in profit in Southeast states. These are, and again, I want to point to you too, the dollar returns as compared to the profit returns. Georgia returning significantly more profit than South Carolina, Kentucky, and North Carolina. I showed a slide earlier. I'm just going to point to this and why this is significant on this slide. And anybody know what year the Georgia Lottery, what year of operation the Georgia Lottery went over $500 million in return to Lottery for Education? I showed it to you earlier. Way back. In our second year of operation, our first full year of operation, we went over $500 million I want to point to North Carolina. Similar in population. It's a newer lottery. Oops. They just went over last year, after 8 years in operation, $500 million. So I want you to understand how productive this lottery is for the state. A little bit about who plays our lottery. When I went to the lottery a couple of years ago to become the CEO, I asked this question. We did a survey and just wanted to profile those who've ever played the lottery. The Bantam Group did a study for us, and we wanted you to see the demographics of the players here in Georgia. And they follow very closely. They align with the U.S. Census data of Georgia's population regarding gender, ethnicity, and income. Approximately half are male, half are female, half are under the age of 45, half are married, half are Caucasian, and approximately half had an annual household income over $50,000. A little bit about our products. What kind of products do we sell? We have two, in terms of the traditional lottery side, two types of products. Draw products, you know those as the ones where you buy your ticket, you tune in and either once or twice a week or even daily to see if you've won, if your ticket was a winning ticket. We also have instant tickets, which are our scratchers at 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20, and 30. And we've just begun offering e-scratch products online. On COAM, we provide oversight. We have oversight responsibility for two types of coin-operated amusement machines: Class A's, which are the kiddie games, arcade games, skee ball, claw machines, those types of games that you would typically see in perhaps a Chuck E. Cheese type of establishment. And then also Class B machines, which are lineup, matchup video games, require an element of skill where you'll pull one of the, pull one line up or down, and the points carry forward. So I'm going to call on our SVP of Finance to come up and talk you through our P&L, and I hope that's okay. Is that all right? Yeah. This is Charmin Lawrence, our SVP of Finance.
Good afternoon, excuse me. So this slide shows a condensed version of our P&L for fiscal year 11 through 15 for traditional lottery sales only. So the first line item obviously is the gross sales, which comprise scratcher sales and our draw game revenue. You can see year over year we've increased that amount. For 15 and 14 we eclipsed $4 billion in gross revenue sales. The next line item down is tickets provided as prizes, which we call free tickets. We show them as a reduction to gross revenue. The next line item is other revenue. Other revenue is comprised of retailer application fees, retailer service fees, NSF fees, and our, no, that's all of it. Sorry, interest income. So then we get down to about a third of the way down, and it shows net revenue. So you see the net revenue year over year for the last 5 years has also increased. The bottom section shows all of our expenses. Prize expense being obviously the largest component of our expenditures. These are the prizes that we pay to our winners on prizes. It increases. It's a blended rate between scratcher payout and draw game payout. It has increased year over year, pretty much driven by the product mix. As scratchers continue to be our most popular product line with our players, we pay out a little bit higher on the scratcher ticket, so it has driven that up a little bit. Operating expenses, which are broken down, we show the line items below that. We show the total and operating expense line. It's comprised of everything other than prizes. So we have the retailer commissions, Those are statutorily mandated at 6% based on the change in March of 2011. The vendor fees, those are contractual obligations to our vendors who provide services for our online gaming systems as well as our instant products. Personnel cost, we're showing that it's consistently been at 0.7% of net revenue. That includes all personnel-related expenditures, salaries, health insurance costs, our contribution to ERS, 401k, and compensated balances, transportation programs, and payroll processing fees. Advertising, that is our production and media for television, radio, our billboards, for our instant and online games. Other gaming, which we often refer to as marketing, is other costs related to sponsorships for sports, special events, POS items, promotional items, some of our gaming equipment, ticket dispensers, monitors, ticket checkers, things of that nature. And the final line item is general and administrative expenses. So those are commonly all the other typical business expenses: depreciation, rent, professional fees, building maintenance, things of that nature. The bottom line shows net proceeds for education, and again, you can see year over year we've been able to increase that number substantially. Not sure if this is page up or page down. Okay, good, page down. The next slide shows our net revenue and our product mix, again showing the same information fiscal year 11 through 15. The blue section shows our scratcher, the portion of our revenue that comes from scratcher sales, and then I'm not sure what color that is over there. Over here it's white. It looks kind of green or beige on the screen. That's our draw product mix. You can see that we have been able to successfully, again, increase net revenues year over year. We have experienced some pressure on our product mix again because our players continue to gravitate towards the instant, the scratcher product. So the mix has gone up or changed somewhat over the last couple of years, in particular as we introduced a higher price point scratcher game last year. And I think I'm going to turn it over to a colleague and let Debbie introduce him. Oops.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call on Lucas Gangone, who is our HOPE recipient on our team, and he is a Georgia Tech grad. He is our Director of Product Development. He's going to really talk about the change in profit margin. We get a lot of questions about this. Return is nearly as practical, 35% of net proceeds. And we really think it's that you will find this interesting. It's really largely due to two things, and I'm going to try not to steal his thunder. It's because our product mix has shifted dramatically since inception, and because in the early years we had lower price point instance, and we've added the $10, $20, $30 price points to our product offerings in the last decade. But I thought you would find this exercise enlightening about the shift in our profit margin and the change in our product mix.
I'm going to grab a water. Thank you, Debbie. Sorry for my voice. It's one of the blessings of having young kids in kindergarten, so apologies for that. So one of the things you'll see on the left side of the screen, it's the fiscal 95 product mix. This was basically out of the gates, what did our product portfolio look like? And a lot of this, again, was driven by market demands. What are our customers buying? As you can see, the majority of the revenues were coming from our draw products. Again, the terminal generated products that Debbie mentioned earlier, while only about 30% was coming from the scratch cards you see at retail. What did that do to the profit margin? Well, profit margin at the time was about 36%, and the profit return was about $500 million for that first year of operation. Overall, the price payout, because so much of the product mix was focused on the draw side of the business, the overall payout for our both lines, both product lines was about 50%, 50.5%. How has that changed in the last 22 years? Well, again, we just finished fiscal 15 with another record year in both top line and bottom line. The profit margin has been compressed some to about 25% due to the product mix. The product mix has changed. 70% of that is now coming from the scratch cards versus 32%, a little bit over, almost 32% is coming from the draw portfolio. Again, that's being driven a lot from the fact that the product portfolio on the scratch side of the business has expanded since over the last 22 years. The first couple price points early on was we were basically offering $1 and $2 scratch tickets. Today we're offering 7 price points. So every price point has specific odds structures and profiles as well as payout profiles. The higher the cost of the ticket, the higher the payout. Hence why you see an increase in overall price payout at the bottom there of about 65%. That's both scratch and draw together. While the profit margin has been compressed some, you can see the profit return is actually almost double to $969.5 million to Hope and Pre-K. Now, I want to do a comparison of the fiscal 15 results that we had. Again, we came off a record year. How do we compare to other lotteries that are higher per capita profit accounts? And New York is one of those states. You can see their product portfolio resembles is 50-50, approximately 50% from scratch, 50% from the draw portfolio. What that does, it obviously improves your overall profit, and the payout tends to be a little lower because so much of the heavy lifting is being done by the draw portfolio. Again, those terminal generated games, examples such as Mega Millions and Powerball, just to kind of frame the discussion. Georgia's number 4 highest per capita states in the country versus New York is number 2. Again, a lot of that is being driven by the market. The irony is, if you were to analyze both the New York and the Georgia draw portfolios, in other words, let's look at what New York has in their draw portfolio. You'll notice that most of the games are actually quite similar. In fact, 2 games are exactly the same, Mega Millions and Powerball. The difference, though, is New York is the 2nd highest per capita Mega Millions state in the country versus Georgia is number 29 out of 45 jurisdictions. So even though we have the same exact products, the Georgia population responds very differently to those products. And that's, so it's a fundamental market-driven phenomena. So what would happen if we were able to replicate, to have the same market demand as New York here in Georgia? Well, what this chart basically shows is that we would increase our incremental profit by $131 million, or our net profit margin by about 3%. We go from 25 to 28 profit margin. If we had the same exact market demand here in Georgia, meaning 50% roughly scratch and 50% draw instead of 70% scratch and 30% draw. Again, something that is generally out of our control. Sharman mentioned basically the free tickets or tickets provided as prizes. One of the ways that we reward players is through a try again or another ticket. They'll buy a ticket, they'll win a free ticket, they'll get to play again, either that game or another game. This is a value to the player. It doesn't have a payout implication in terms of increasing the aggregate payout, but it does have a benefit in the calculus of product value to the customer. We've kept that relatively flat. It's about 7% of total gross revenues that we give back to players in a form of a try again, in quotes. Our aggregate payout has remained relatively flat as well, roughly about 64%. That's, again, across scratch and draw, which are traditional product lines. I'm not talking about co-am. And you can see over the last 5 years, even though we've increased profits, payouts have remained relatively flat.
So I know that was a lot to digest, but basically what's happened over the last 20 years is our players have moved from draw-based games to scratch in a big way. We are constantly focused on developing engaging draw games, adding enhancements to our existing games. Since I've been at the Georgia Lottery, we've rolled either an enhancement or a new draw game just about every single quarter, and we're going to continue to do that. One thing I want to point out to you is if you'll go back to the early deck and look at New York's performance this year, is down about $100 million in profit. That's partially due to the impact that very few rolls, very few large jackpots for Mega and Power, and sales being down about 17% nationwide for those two products. Lucas told you that we are not heavily leveraged into, I think we said we ranked 29th in Powerball. Yeah, Mega Millions. That's when it works to your advantage. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have a larger instant portfolio mix than draw, because draws are unpredictable. You don't know when you're going to get the jackpots. You don't know how large they're going to get. And in periods when the numbers the jackpots don't roll, the revenue is really unreliable. So it works to our advantage to have a stronger scratch portfolio than draw, and right now we're trying to manage that mix and really grow the draw portfolio somewhat. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our retailers. We have about approximately 8,700 retailers for the Georgia Lottery Corporation statewide. We also have direct sales where we act as the retailer at the two airport baggage claims, north and south baggage claims. We also do prize payment and sell tickets at our 8 district offices and at our headquarters building. We have just begun in late 2012 to sell our products on the internet. We've added a few products since since we went live on the internet. Last year, those sales amounted to $25 million. Our top performing retailers are at our baggage claim, as well as on our, around in the retailers that are around our state borders. About 76% of our retailers are small business. The average retailer will earn about $25,000 a year in commissions from the Georgia Lottery. The high traffic retailers can earn upwards of $100,000 a year in retailer commissions. We are highly leveraged at C-stores, about 71%. 10% in grocery, and the others are at other locations, including locations like bars and restaurants. How productive are the Georgia Lottery retailers? Just wanted you to understand that we have a highly productive team of retailers that work with us. We have, again, approximately 8,700 retailers. Average weekly sales by retailer is about $8,276. Not about, I think that is the actual in FY14. How do we fare in the Southeast? The most productive, 8,700 retailers, and again, the average weekly sales per retailer. Highly productive retailers here in Georgia. Retailer operating expenses and retailer commissions. We wanted to see that they are directly tied to sales. They are, although this chart really doesn't tell you, this is based on a percent of gross revenue, because we act as retailers at all those locations that we showed you earlier, the 2 at baggage claim, our 8 district offices. This shows that they earn slightly less, but if you backed out those, we actually pay 6% of gross revenues, which is what is set statutorily. And again, I think we pointed to earlier, these were changed in 2011. So where do we rank in terms of retailer commissions as a percent of net sales? You'll see we're about middle of the pack here nationally. And again, some of the most productive retailers in the country. I'm going to ask Jarman to come and talk to you about vendor fees.
So on this vendor fee, slide, We have two main vendors that we use. IGT provides our gaming services, online system, pretty much the tickets that are generated for our draw games. And then Scientific Games provides our instant scratcher product and inventory for that. The other category is other vendors, which basically are the other services related to multi-state games, draw audit fees, licensed products, and other on-air draw expenses. You can see that we've pretty much maintained about 2% of our net revenue going towards vendor fees. Again, these are contractual obligations. For IGT, we pay them 1.15% of sales, net sales, and then for Sci Games, it's 0.99%. These are negotiated rates. For IGT, we also have some variable expenses in there as well, negotiated rates for development of our premium products, for our instant, our DigiGame products, marketing support, and our call center. These contracts, as you can see from the footnote number 1, were originally awarded in 2003 and renegotiated in 2008, extending it to 2013. They were then renegotiated in 2011 and extended to September of 2018. Our plan, of course, is to bid these two contracts out. It's been our experience that you get healthy competition when you go through the bidding process, which we recently experienced with the awarding of the contract for our COAM system to Intralot. So our expectation is to leverage that experience and the bidding and the competition to get the best pricing. We saw about a range of 80% lower between the pricing between the highest bid and the lowest bid from our COAM award, and the other two were about in the middle, 40 to 50% lower than the lowest bid. So again, our intent is to bid out those two contracts. Let's see. Year over year, again, the change, it has increased in vendor fees, but it's primarily driven, again, by our success in our ticket sales. They're proportional and related. Page down. I think that's all I had for vendor fees. I thought you were doing this.
So a little bit about our employees as well. We are charged statutorily to do a minority report. We will have copies of those delivered to every one of your offices. In it, we talk about employee tenure. 65% of our employees have over 6 years of service. Almost 50% have 10 years of service or more, and approximately 17% have over 20 years of service. And providing you with turnover, last year we had about 7% turnover at the Georgia Lottery Corporation. Our employees, just in terms of ethnic diversity, about 66% are minorities, 34% are non-minorities, 57% are females, and 43% are males. Of the 13 individuals who comprise our senior leadership team, those are VPs and above, 6 are minorities and 4 are females. We are, again, charged statutorily to provide you this with our Georgia Lottery Minority Business Participation Report, and we'll see that those are delivered to you as well. Sherman, you're going to do salaries.
Yes. So this slide shows, again, fiscal year 10 through 15, our salaries and total head count. At the bottom, the box shows the actual head count between GLC employees and COAM employees, which we started onboarding that division last fiscal year, or 2 fiscal years ago, excuse me, because we're in 16 now, in 14. This is just the salary amount, period. This is not including any other personnel costs that I spoke to earlier. As you can see, again, in 14, we onboarded COAM, started with 11 employees, and then we onboarded additional employees in 15 with the launching of the centralized system and transitioning the enforcement and compliance activities from DOR over to the GLC. The next slide is a slide. We want it to be completely transparent and provide a slide that showed our bonuses and our payout of our bonuses over fiscal year 10 through 15. All of our bonuses are again approved by our board. 10 was prior to the change, the legislative change that went into effect in 2011. 11 was a prorated year up until the change in March of that year. Statutorily, after that change was in place, we are capping our bonuses at 1% of the increase in net revenue year over year. So it's tied directly to our performance. The next slide is our operating expense category for advertising. Again, that's production and media for television, radio, billboards. And you can see the allocation between production costs and media over the last 5 fiscal years. It traditionally ranges between 0.5 and 0.6% of total revenue. The next chart just shows how the Georgia Lottery lines up as advertising as a percentage of net sales. We're on the lower end of the scheme. We're, I think, 4th lowest of the lotteries that are reported. The next slide is marketing. That's really that terminology that I talked about, which was other gaming, which talked about our ticket dispensers, our sports and event sponsorships, our promotional items, our point of sale items, and some of our gaming equipment, such as monitors, ticket checkers. Shows a total ad spend on advertising and marketing as a category together of around 1% of total revenues. The next slide shows the distribution of net revenues just for the traditional lottery over the last 5 fiscal years, going from left to right and then going from the bottom to the top of each bar chart. Bar shows general and administrative. Again, overall, that's 1% when you add in personnel cost and general and administrative together collectively. Then advertising and other gaming, which we just saw a moment ago on the slide, advertising and marketing, again, about 1%. Vendor fees, again, a contractual obligation of approximately 2% over the last 5 fiscal years. Retailer commissions, statutorily required to pay out at 6% of gross sales. Prize expense, our largest expenditure, again, driven by a blended rate between our scratcher products and our draw activities. And then our actual, the green top part of each of the bars is our net proceeds return and the margin related to the return on that year. And I'm going to turn it over to Lucas, I believe.
So we're going to talk to you about how we forecast, because I know you want us to get to the point, right? So, and tell us what we're forecasting in the years ahead. So I apologize for that lesson in, we're going to call Lottery 101, but we think it's really important that we're transparent with you, that you understand our business at a detailed level. We want you to understand it, and it's our best interest as well. But we're going to get to the point here, and I think you've waited a long time to do that. I've asked Lucas because he and James Sessions, who is our Director of Budget and Finance, to kind of, I forget what your title is, James, but he actually helped these two work together to do our forecast as well as with our sales team. We do a really good job of projecting it on, our budgets on an annual basis. He's going to talk to you about what we do annually, but for the purposes of this committee, we wanted to give you some longer range projections, and so we've gone with some 3, 5, 10-year trends, both within the GLC and what we see in the highest performing lotteries. That's what he's going to talk to you about right now.
Thank you, Debbie. So one of the things we do, obviously, is everything we launch, all of our products on both sides of the portfolio, we want to make sure they're entertaining games and games that resonate with our players. So we do a lot of analytics in terms of what works and what doesn't, as well as market research. That's one of the things that we're very, very focused on, is making sure that we're designing games that just really resonate with our players. And so we look at various games by price point. We track the trends of various price points over time and see what the trends both in Georgia as well as nationally are, so we can get ahead of the curve if we start seeing some major shifts in consumer behavior. So one of the things we do is we have schedules, and these schedules have very specific game information by price point, by payout, by odd structures, and we use that and we create that and then back into the projection, so that we know exactly what's going to launch and what the attributes of those products are. So we know that we need to have a certain mix of price points. We know that we have to have so many 1s and 2s and 5s and so many 30s and so on and so forth. So all this is really part of a larger trend analysis that we do internally, and then we superimpose the research that comes back from market data while talking to our players. So again, a lot of historical trends information, and then we also have a lot of strategic initiatives that the company discusses. The whole executive team and even other groups within the company work on this on a larger scale every year to come up with strategies to drive sales. Another thing we do, obviously, several of our games are multi-jurisdictionals, like Mega Millions and Powerball. Those, because they're national games, they're committees and working groups that work on evolving those products, in other words, changing the matrix over time or changing certain attributes and components of those games. So those are typically national working groups that are made up by several of my colleagues in other jurisdictions, and typically the head of it is typically a lottery director, and we work together in a very collegial way to figure out ways to make the game evolve the game and lengthen its life cycle, because like any other product that we as consumers buy, after a while things can get stale, and so we try to see how do we evolve it, how we make it better over time. So what this shows, we're going to take a quick step back and look at Georgia Lottery, how we compare to the top per capita profit lotteries. We looked at earlier, we saw Massachusetts, New York were ahead of us. This is the whole grouping. If you see over the last 3 years, Georgia Lottery has grown profits by 3.6% versus all of those lotteries. These are, again, the top performing per capita profit lotteries grew their profits by 1.57%. Over the last 5 years, Georgia was slightly down to the total because of the fact actually the fiscal 11 was a down year for us. It was one of 2 down years in our 22-year history. That was in fiscal year 11, and so that's why you see that number really being a little bit lower than the top performing lotteries. However, if you look at it over time, including the 10-year trend, you'll see that we're at 1.81% growth per year versus the 1.59%, which is the benchmark that we use to make sure that we're tracking above and beyond average. So back to the strategic focus that I mentioned on the 2 slides ago. Obviously, we are very, very laser focused on draw games. Draw games are very profitable, and they are they're very profitable. And so we constantly look for ways to not only evolve our current portfolio, but also to look for draw games that could be introduced that can really resonate with Georgians. As we discussed earlier, some games just don't resonate as well as they do maybe in the Northeast. And again, some of those are just purely market-driven realities. You can't control the marketplace. We've been focusing very actively on the quality of distribution and inventory optimization. This is for a scratch product, making sure the right tickets, the right price points are going to the right retailers, that there are no stockouts, that they have the right products on hand over the weekend, during holidays when sales tend to spike. So all these are variables and factors that we keep very much focused on to make sure that we're not leaving anything on the table. Obviously, the other area is looking for non-traditional locations to expand sales of our products. We're heavily reliant on C-stores, and they're our bread and butter. We're also looking for other areas where maybe players would want to see our products sold that are currently not being offered. So that's just another area of opportunity we feel very strongly about pursuing and exploring. Of course, we're in the digital age. We're looking at deploying a mobile sales channel. This is something that is in our roadmap. Of course, nowadays you can buy just about anything over the internet, so this is another channel that definitely needs to be leveraged for us to make our product more readily available to players and to folks that want to play our games. And lastly, operational efficiencies. This is something that any organization, I'm sure, can benefit from. Really taking a hard look at operationally at all the business units and leveraging and looking for opportunities to just be more efficient in everything we do. This is something that, of course, doesn't just come from the top, but from every level of the organization, and we are working very actively across all business units to achieve this. So Debbie mentioned projections. What this is basically pretty much an average of our 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year profit growth, and mapped from, as you can see, fiscal 16 as our budgeted number of $990 million profit. If we follow our 10-year average, you'll see that's the blue line, which is the steeper line, which will get us by fiscal 20 to $1.14 billion in profit. The next line below it is that green line. It's I'm sorry, that was the 3-year average. Apologies on that. The next line below that is the 10-year average. That's the green line. Over the next until to fiscal 20, there will be a $1.063 billion profit number to Hope and Pre-K. And then right below that is the national average over the next 5 years. We're looking at, if we follow that trend, we'll be at $1.054 billion to Hope and Pre-K. I believe there's one more. That's it? So we, of course, this is one good way, by using the 3, the 5, and the 10-year growth percentages, it helps factor out anomalies you may see. Like some years ago, we had a snow event that locked down the city. All these kind of things that are, let's just say, supernatural tend to have implications on our sales short term. So by looking at the 3, the 5, and the 10, it kind of smooths out those events that could hurt us, that have hurt us in the past, without weighing too heavily on its implications for the trend line. So we felt that using real data was the most realistic way to map this.
So that completes, our presentation on traditional lottery operations. I wanted to cover with you as well the coin-operated amusement machine function that was transferred to us in April of 2013. The responsibility did reside with the Department of Revenue to license those locations. With the transfer, additional responsibilities were added to the Georgia Lottery in addition to just licensing of owners and operators of Class A and Class B machines. We became responsible not only for the licensing function, but also the issuance of decals for all of those machines, the collection of all the licensing revenue, the implementation of a centralized accounting system, and collection of the net proceeds from those Class B machines, as well as all compliance and enforcement activities. Then in this past legislative session, a bill was passed, SB 190, that added some additional provisions for the Georgia Lottery to implement. We were originally tasked with licensing retail and the masters, the owners of the machines. SB 190 added the licensing of manufacturers and distributors to our responsibilities. It also mandated an arbitration process for license disputes, created the ability for us to do staggered licensing instead of doing it annually at the beginning of the fiscal year. Placed a cap on the number of master licensees and provided that no more than 9 COAMs could be in a single location. So a little bit about what was done. The COAM industry grew up in Georgia, and it didn't grow up in a single night. I think that industry has been growing for many years in Georgia. And so when the baton was passed to the Georgia Lottery Corporation, we began to look at the opportunity to build integrity into the licensing system. Because of the timing that initial year, the bill was signed into law at the end of April. We were already into license renewal for FY14. We negotiated intergovernmental agreements with the Department of Revenue to license those licensees for FY14. We also, because we had reporting requirements, went to the Department of Audits and set up an intergovernmental agreement for them to audit these locations and masters because they provided third-party objectivity in what was reported to the Georgia Lottery Corporation. Additionally, we really wanted to focus on law enforcement and illegal gambling activities here in Georgia. I worked with the director of the GBI to fund a illegal gambling task force within GBI, and we have also added some additional resourcing this past year, the first such activity for the GBI, at least a dedicated task force for that function. So those were the first things we did just to out of the gate. During that FY14, we also had to develop and deploy a revenue reporting system in the interim period of actually procuring a centralized COAM accounting system. So we had to write and deploy this revenue reporting system. We began to develop an online licensing system with integrity checks. And so let me tell you what those integrity checks that were new to this industry. We began to do tax compliance checking. We began to do background checking. And as well, we did checking at the Secretary of State for business licenses. And then we did background checks as well. And so these were the increased integrity checks that we put into place from a regulator standpoint to ensure integrity in our licensees. We created an online licensing application during that year. We developed our rules and regulations. We met monthly with the coin-operated amusement machine advisory board, and we wrote and awarded an RFP for a centralized gaming system. We began staffing up, as you saw from the budget presentation earlier, that division as well, hiring, I believe, about 11 people in 2014 to staff this function. We increased our, the GLC board voted to increase the amount of funding that went to the Department of Behavioral Health for responsible gaming, for problem gaming from $200,000 to $400,000. The GLC required all of those machines to be decaled or stickered with responsible gaming messaging, as well as a 1-800 call number for those who might have some issues with problem gaming. And we created an anonymous tip line for consumers to report COAM fraud and abuse. That's just a few of the activities that happened in FY14. In FY15, we had a year to staff up the operation. We brought the licensing and enforcement activities that we had contracted with Department of Revenue to do through that intergovernmental agreement back in-house to the Georgia Lottery, staffed up an enforcements and investigations unit, and processed all of those licensing applications for FY15 within the GLC. We processed 8,100 Class A and Class B licenses with all of those integrity checks in place. We also, during that year, tested and certified the centralized system and then onboarded about 20,000 COAM devices that were fielded in about 5,000 locations across the state. We set up the licensing and arbitration system. We hired a hearing officer. Many of you may be familiar with our first hearing officer, Mike Bowers. Mike left us in the past couple of months, and that function is now staffed by Bob Wilson. We increased our compliance and enforcement and education efforts with all of law enforcement. There were some activities related to law enforcement prior to the Georgia Lottery Corporation taking over this function, but we have certainly ramped that up significantly. A lot of that required education efforts with local law enforcement and state law enforcement agencies. I recruited John Hayden out of the GBI. Many of you may know him. He was also a fixture at GBI and in a leadership role there. to lead this effort for us. And so had strong relationships within the law enforcement community, allowed us to significantly ramp up our education efforts, not only with law enforcement, with Department of Audits Accounts and Department of Revenue. So let's talk a little bit about COAM enforcement. So we went from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time. Last year we conducted over 4,000 compliance checks and inspections statewide, and we've issued over 1,300 citations from those inspections, netting almost $1 million in fines that were levied. Department of Audits conducted over 340 audits for us to validate the reporting and compliance efforts at retail and with our master licensees. In working with GBI, GBI served over 58 search warrants, made 36 arrests, and received and seized currency, bank accounts, and personal property. And we've suspended 48 retailers due to illegal gambling activities. It's important for us to tell you as well that when they're suspended from being a COAM retailer, they're also, if they are a GLC retailer, suspended as a GLC retailer as well. I'm going to ask Charmin to run through those financials with you, and then we'll follow with projections from this new responsibility and then consolidated projections for both of those two functions within the GLC.
Okay, this is our P&L for fiscal year 14 and 15 for the COAM line of business. For 14, again, we received the funds directly collected for licensing from the Department of Revenue. Again, the centralized system was not launched until January of this year, so all of those activities, the first line item, shows reflected in 15. I'm going to go through 14. Again, we received over $10 million in licensing revenues that Debbie talked about for Class A and Class B machines from masters and locations, a little small amount of interest income from the amounts that we had in our bank accounts. We had personnel costs. Again, we added, I believe, 11 positions in 14 to start off our COAM division, and our operating expenses, the typical common ones, an allocation of rent, professional fees, typical building maintenance, supplies, typical business expenses and operating expenses. We separated out our relationships with government entities. Again, DOR handled the licensing and enforcement for fiscal year 14 for us. Debbie just mentioned the amount of audits that the Department of Audits and Accounts conducted on our behalf to validate the information submitted monthly, as well as going out to the locations, and then our relationship with GBI for their assistance with investigations and enforcements as well. So that's a total operating expense. That's adding the previous ones to the government entity ones for the total of the $3.2 million. Again, since we had not launched the system until this fiscal year, or this past fiscal year, 15, there were no vendor fees associated with that. So we had actually raised $6.9 million in revenues in fiscal year 14. We transferred $5 million of that, the bottom line. We withheld $1.9 with approval of our board. Just because we're completely self-funded, we do not receive any funds, we felt it prudent to hold back that amount until we were sure that we were going to be able to successfully launch the system in January and onboard the machines. And then that, obviously, you can see in the next year when I go through 15 that we transferred that 1.9 in fiscal year 15. So in 15, again, the first line item, we received almost $6 million in revenues from the hooking up of the Class B machines to the centralized system. That began in January. We had a 6-month rollout process. Intralot worked very aggressively to get all of those machines hooked up to the system within that time frame. As Debbie mentioned, about 20,000 machines in 5,000 locations across the state. We received $8.8 million in licensing revenues in fiscal year 15. We also had collected $470,000 in the penalty and assessment from those assessments, fines handed out. Since we started sweeping the system in January, these locations for the revenues, we have experienced some that did not pay timely, so we've charged them NSF fees for that. We also this year included a processing fee charge for these renewals when they renewed online, whether they paid us ACH or via credit cards, to offset some of our financial services fees cost and interest income as well. Personnel costs, again, we added additional positions as we brought in the licensing and the enforcement in-house from DOR, requiring us to hire additional personnel. Our operating expense cost, which I've already mentioned before, professional fees, allocation of rent, supplies, maintenance, our tip line that Debbie talked about, those types of expenses. Then the expenses related to our relationship with the government agencies, as you can see, DOR decreased, again, because we bought the licensing and the code. The enforcement activities in-house, they still do compliance checks on statutory owed taxes, business taxes, revenue taxes, to make sure that they clear those debts with the state before we process their license. Continue to have a relationship with the Department of Audits and Accounts for them going out and doing audits of the locations to make sure that they have properly documented all of their receipts. And again, expanded our relationship with GBI this fiscal year. Gaming expenses, vendor fees, again, a contractual obligation from our bid process that we conducted last year. The winning vendor was Intralot. And so net proceeds for 15 were $9 million for 15, and then we also transferred again that 1.9 that we retained from 14 for a total transfer in 15 of $10.9 million. So projected profits for COAM. We're showing on this slide our actual transfer amount from 14, our actual transfer amount from fiscal year 15, our budgeted amount that we anticipate transferring for fiscal year 16, and then we show our projections for 17 through fiscal year 20. We basically kept our volume of activity as far as the number of machines connected to the system relatively flat, just a small increase over our budget for fiscal year 16. The increase shown is purely driven by the amount of shared revenue percentage increase that we get year over year. So as you know, in the statute, it was written that we would get an additional 1% each year until we reach 10% of net revenues as a part of our revenue sharing. So by fiscal year 20, we'll be receiving 10% of the net revenue from the COAM machines. This slide consolidates what Lucas presented as far as the projections for traditional lottery, GLC, and lays onto it, adds on the COAM projection from the previous slide. So again, 14 shows our actual return, 15 actual return, 16 budgeted return of just over $1 billion, 17 through 20. So the last numbers out to the right are actually showing where we anticipate being by adding GLC and COAM together. The blue line is the 5-year projection, which is about a 3.78 growth percentage rate of traditional lottery. The green line, I believe, is the 10-year rate at 1.8%, and the black line shows the 5-year average. So those are, again, consolidated GLC and COAM profits together. And I'm going to turn it back to Debbie for closing.
So we gave you these ranges because we think we'll fall somewhere in the middle. There are lots of things that we can't control. Lucas alluded to some of those earlier: weather events, gas prices, the economy. And so we felt that the best way to give you projections for the out years is to use those averages. This concludes our presentation, our formal presentation. If you have any questions, we're prepared to answer them to the best of our abilities.
Thank you, Ms. Alford. Very good information. I'm curious, I'm sure you've interacted with your fellow lottery directors around the country, And in states where casinos, horse racing, pyramid, the proposals that we're going to be talking about as the meetings go on have been enacted after a lottery already existed, and to the extent that the information is available, how has that impacted lottery sales when new forms of gambling are authorized by a particular state?
Well, Senator, we've just begun our research on the impact of states who have had casinos come in after there were lotteries. I don't want to really speak to any numbers because, we're still working with our lotteries to get those numbers so that we can actually let data and that experience speak for itself. I can tell you anecdotally that, in the states where lotteries existed prior to casinos, there was cannibalization. Maryland being the most recent state, and we talked to their former director, and he told us it was from 3 to 5%, but that overall proceeds grew for the state. And I think as well what we're trying to do we've talked to our counterparts in Pennsylvania, New York, and I have some of their research. We've not synthesized it yet, but they've shared some of their analysis with us, and we can leave that with you. I think we would anticipate that there would be cannibalization of the lottery in terms of sales, as not only traditional lottery sales, but also from the coin-operated amusement machine part of our business, but we have not put pencil to paper to try to quantify that. And we will certainly be very interested to hear from others, speakers, witnesses that you've invited, so that we can better assess and quantify that, if there will be, how much initially and how much over time.
So when you said there were, the traditional lottery sales were down roughly 3 to 5%. I'm not going to hold you to that, but then but revenues overall were up when you factor in the.
That's the information that we learned from the Maryland lottery, and again, haven't been able to synthesize that all because we've talking not only to the Maryland lottery. Maryland happens to be one of the more recent, but we're trying to compile the data from other lotteries such as the New York lottery, the Kansas lottery, Ohio. And certainly it will vary, quite honestly, by the number of casinos that did come in, where they were located, how densely we might have retailers in that area or territory. There will also be an impact on local retailers as well. So we will certainly continue to work on that analysis and be happy to share with you. And we know that we're going to learn more from many of the witnesses that are going to come forward and testify during these proceedings as well.
And how many states? I think I know one or two, but you may know more. How many states is the regulatory function kind of under the same umbrella? I think a couple of the proposals that are out there have proposed that lottery build out its infrastructure if one of these proposals were to be enacted.
Yeah, and that varies. I think there's probably, I certainly haven't done a survey of states. I certainly have talked to my counterparts where I knew that there were everything was housed in one, regulatory body. West Virginia, I'm trying to think, Ohio, New York. They've got to give me some help here, and I believe Maryland as well. So maybe a handful of states where all gaming was housed under one regulatory body, and then there are some where casinos are broken out, and VLTs might be with the lottery, and then table gaming and casinos might be with another authority. So I think it varies widely across jurisdictions.
Could I ask kind of a homework assignment, if you
Sure.
will?
Yes, sir.
To gather and share in states where it is kind of housed under the lottery's umbrella, to provide us some feedback in the next couple of months on regulatory challenges, what what the pros and cons have been, how it's worked from an infrastructure standpoint, and just provide us some feedback from the lottery's perspective on how that could work or not work.
Certainly. We'll do that survey with those jurisdictions where it's housed under a single authority and where it's not. I think we've asked that question anecdotally as well. I think from those jurisdictions where it is under one house, of course, they seem to think that it's enabled them to leverage the infrastructure, the gaming expertise, as well as the resources to deploy those solutions very quickly. So that's what we're hearing anecdotally, but I definitely would want to survey my counterparts and, about their lessons learned, the pros and cons.
Chairman Beach.
Yeah, Ms. Alford, great job to your staff. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, I understand that Alabama is discussing starting a lottery. Is there any data that shows what a neighboring state does to lottery sales? If that were to
they will cannibalize lottery sales as well. Certainly one of our biggest retailers is on the Alabama border. I won't name that retailer, but certainly our the retailer that sells the most in the state is on the Alabama border. It certainly will cannibalize, but we can put some paper a pencil to paper and give you an estimate of what that would do should that happen as well.
Thank you.
Chairman Smyrie.
Ms. Alford, on page 6 is something that jumped out at me, and I too believe in the polls and in the rankings, and I want to commend you and your entire team. I watched the lottery from its inception, starting to talk about it in 1989 and 90, then to its inception in 1992. And I want to thank you for the work that you do, but what struck me on would you drill a little bit on the national rankings when it says number 4 per capital returns to beneficiaries? Could you?
Yes, I can. In fact, I'll take you to slide 7 and 8. And what per cap is based on the dollar returns to the lottery for education divided by, and so that's our profit, and that's what gets returned to the lottery for education. And in 2015, we returned from just lottery proceeds $969,600,000. We take that and we divide it by the population, which you can see for Georgia is 10, according to the 2014 estimated census data, 10,100,000 Georgians. And so then you can, by dividing those, you can see how much we're returning to every person, to our population for each citizen in Georgia.
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road at, and I'm interested in that, and I appreciate that number 4 ranking because that's the investment in our human and our intellectual capital, going back to the population, and for that I'm grateful. One other point on page 10. What do you attribute to the fact that Georgia was number 1 and in terms of percentage on profit? What did we do that was so great that
well, I have a great team,
okay.
And we have a very collaborative partnership with our vendors and a very motivated retailer base. But I think over the past few years, we have really focused on our in-state draw games, quite honestly. And so, whether it's our Keno products or whether it's our daily games, we saw significant growth in both our daily games as well as our draw games. We also launched an in-state, one of our first in-state. We did one in 2013 as well, but a new successful draw game called Jumbo Bucks Lotto. So it's keen focus on in-state draw games. The national products, and I think this is what hurt many states. They have significant sales of the Mega Powerball products, and so those products have been characterized by jackpot fatigues. people getting in the game later, and certainly very, very few jackpots last year. Nationally, Mega and Power were down about 17%. They were down about 17% here in Georgia as well. But our keen focus on other draw games, and you'll see that going forward as well, allowed us to weather, the downturn in sales for Mega and Power. I think as well, I'm going to recognize the team here. You met Lucas Gangone, and we have others that participate with him as well. Really doing a really great job of ensuring that when we launch our scratch product, that each one is a home run. And so keen focus on, for each product we launch, all of the research to support it. And so I think we've done a really good job with our scratch product as well.
Thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cowsert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hoffer, what keeps coming back to me is the fact that the lottery is compelled by law to return as close as practical 35% of your net sales to the Hope and pre-K programs. And, your charts there on slide 17 showed that initially you were given a 36% profit margin, and now you're down to 25%. When you got sales of close to $4 billion, that's $400 million sitting there that we don't maybe even need another revenue source if you would just comply with that law.
Well, I think it says as practical as possible, and you
Right.
probably saw that we've maintained that profit margin of around 25% for the past 5 years. What happened initially, and I think this is what Lucas spoke to you about earlier, we were heavily draw-based then. That was the first products out of the gate. I think we offered a couple of draw games and only one and $2 price point instance. Over time, particularly here in Georgia, draw games lost. They lost in popularity, and folks moved more to scratch. You'll look at the profit, the dollar profit that we had when sales were, when the profit margin was 36%, it's half of what it is now. So the movement in the product mix from draw to scratch, our players migrated to the scratch product. And scratch paid out. It's an instant product. People expect instant gratification. And this is not unique to Georgia, as players migrate. And you'll see this phenomena in other states as well. As players migrate to the scratch product, which have higher payouts not only in Georgia but nationally, that erodes your profitability. But because you sell those tickets, you sell more of those tickets, the churn, the volume of those sales actually generates more profit. You can't spend profit margin. If you want us to go back and return 36% to you, which states like Louisiana do, they return 36%. You can go and look and see what you might be looking at in terms of profit. So you have to evolve your business. Apple today was not the Apple in 1980. It's radically transformed its business. It's went where customer demand has driven it. So you really have to decide, are you going to run as a business? Are you going to morph your business to meet the demand of your customers? Or are you going to hold to an old business model that doesn't meet the demand of your customers? We strive every day. Each one of us has a hope story that we could share with you personally. We are focused like lasers on returning as much profit, many dollars as we can potentially to Hope and Pre-K. And if we could move that needle where we could change our draw and we're focused like it on a laser. If we could sell more draw product, trust me, we would, because we all personally own that mission of maximizing revenues to education. But and I think you'll hear this from when you talk to other members in the other witnesses from gaming industries. People change their demands as society changes. That's what's happened here in Georgia. It's not unique to Georgia. It's a national phenomena, and we can sit down and talk with you through each and every state, their product mix, their price payout, and how it's moved over time.
So they're migrating to our least profitable line. I wonder if they're migrating there because we're paying out so much prize money there. Y'all had a New York slide that showed them with a good 50-50 mix.
Well, you know, I can't speak to that, but sometimes you can't unwind that as well, right? I'm trying to sell more products, Senator Cowsert, in the draw space. And quite honestly, that strategy worked well for us. It didn't, you can see it shifted our profit margin, but my draw sales were up over the prior year by I think about 2%. Is that right? 2.1%. I'm working on it. But I can't make people buy what they don't want. And over time, folks have migrated, players have migrated to scratch, which is a less profitable product line. Yes, you're right, but that's what's happened, and it's not unique to Georgia. You know, and we're being responsive to consumer demand. I wasn't here in those early years. Could we have moved that? Could we have done something different? We've always been a very, very, very successful lottery. And I think you can look and you can see the dollar profit we return is much more than many states of a similar size. And so I think that the lottery was being responsive to customer demand. You know, I think, again, we're one of the most successful lotteries in the country in terms of returning profit to our citizens.
Thank you.
Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm almost afraid to ask this question after I appreciate your passion.
If I can do it, I will.
I appreciate your passion for the issue very much, and I appreciate the fact that we've got an enormously profitable lottery and a very, very successful lottery by any measure. And I'm also appreciative of the outpouring of interest in the Hope Scholarship Fund here in this room, as witnessed by this attendance. Referencing page 15 on the net proceeds for education, do we know, or do we have a chart, or do we have the information that compares us to other lotteries, other states, and how that 25, 25.5, and 24.8 compare to other states? Was my first question.
Do we have? I don't think we have that.
That's
for
okay.
All, for 25, but certainly we can get that for all states.
I think that would be
easy
interesting.
to calculate for all of these states, as you know, based on what you see here. But we will get that to you.
Thank you very much. And also, I think it's an observation that is it coincidental that as our profits have decreased, surrounding states have come on board. South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee have all come on board, creating more competition.
Well, that's true. They
so
have.
I would encourage some of these lobbyists to go over in Alabama and work against the lottery.
Thank you.
So, just an observation.
No, our profits have, the only 2 years that our profits decreased were in 1998 and 2011. Mm-hmm. So we've continued to grow sales as well as profit in every year but those 2 years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alford. No more questions. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
We're going to stand down for about 90 seconds so Ms. Chastain can get in position over there and set up AV. All right, we're gonna recognize the next witness. If you could please have a seat. Thank you. Our next witness is Tricia Chastain, who's the president of the Georgia Student Finance Commission. She's no stranger to us. She's doing great work over there, and before that, we all got to know her in her work as the Vice President for Government Relations at the University of Georgia. Thank you for your service to our state over a very long period of time. We look forward to hearing from you. You were kind of the natural next witness as we set the stage for the discussion on the various proposals to potentially identify additional streams of revenue for the Hope Scholarship. And we've heard from the lottery and kind of where we are as a lottery today, and now I think you're going to provide us a little insight on where we are in terms of the scholarship and the value of the scholarship relative to tuition brings for Georgia students today. So Ms. Chastain, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Ramsey and Chairman Beach. I appreciate the opportunity to come before the committee today to talk about this important program. Chairman Beach mentioned that his daughter was a Hope Scholar, and Debbie mentioned that her both her daughter and son were Hope Scholars, and this scholarship is personal for me as well. I actually was a Hope Scholar, and both of my sons, Henry and Will, participated in the state pre-K program. So this is personal for a lot of Georgians, and it is for me as well. So I'm grateful for the great work that the lottery does every day to make it possible. And I hope the fact that I'm a Hope Scholar is not the most surprising fact that the committee uncovers in the next couple of days. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Peavy. He's going to tag team the presentation with me today. Dr. Peavy is a vice president for research at Georgia Student Finance, has over 20 years of experience in data analysis, research, and public education. So I think the committee will find his work and his expertise very helpful as you try to gather information. So he's going to tag team the presentation with me today. We have 4 objectives today. First, we want to go over the HOPE programs with you. There are 6 lottery-funded HOPE programs. A lot of attention is often on the scholarship, but there are other programs. We want to make sure you're aware of all the lottery-funded programs. Then we want to take a look at the 2011 reforms. Those reforms, many of you were here, so you know that they were done to stabilize a program that was quickly going to bankrupt the lottery, and they have done that, and we'll review those reforms. And then number 3, we want to look at the impact of those reforms in terms of the cost of the program. And then finally, look at the impact of those reforms on the beneficiaries. What % of tuition is HOPE covering today? So we'll take a look at all those things. We have several things that we provided in your packet that I just want to point out. One, we have an overview, just a one-page overview of all the HOPE programs in your packet. We also have all the HOPE-eligible institutions, public, private, and technical college as well. And then finally, we have this chart, which I think you will find helpful. This is our award chart. On the front, you'll see the HOPE Scholarship Award chart, which will show you every year since the reforms were done, the tuition rate, the HOPE rate, and then factored in the % of tuition that HOPE is covered every year from FY12 through FY16. On the back of that, you'll find the same information for the HOPE grant. Now, the HOPE grant is a little bit easier to do because TCSG, where these students largely attend, has a standard across-the-board tuition. So you'll see it for HOPE grant. We did stack onto that strategic industries. Students can get HOPE grant or Zell Miller grant plus strategic industries workforce development grant if they study in any of those 10 programs that are listed at the bottom of the award chart. So we also show the % of tuition that's covered for those students who are using both of those programs. It would be difficult for me to start without, and Debbie alluded to this, without just recognizing the tremendous impact of this program. $7.7 billion, over 1.7 million students over its 22-year history. It was the first program of its type. Many states, as you alluded to, have tried to follow since. A merit-based scholarship funded solely by the lottery, and the numbers obviously speak for themselves. These are the programs that are covered under the lottery. The scholarship programs, HOPE and Zell, are for degree-seeking students, associate or bachelor degree-seeking students. The HOPE scholarship has gone largely unchanged in terms of the GPA requirement. It's a 3.0, and you have to maintain the 3.0 GPA while you're in school. Zell Miller was done with the 2011 reforms. You need a 3.7 GPA. It covers full tuition, but you need a 3.7 GPA, a 1200 on your SAT, or a 26 on the ACT. Every salutatorian and valedictorian in the state also received the Zell Miller scholarship as well. The right side are the HOPE grant programs. So HOPE grant are the grant programs, which are for our students who are pursuing certificates or diplomas. HOPE grant, there's no academic requirement out of high school. You just have to maintain a 2.0 GPA in school, in post-secondary. The Zell Miller grant, again, no academic requirement outside of high school, but you have to maintain a 3.5 GPA while you're in college. Strategic industries I alluded to earlier. These are now it's 141 programs across the technical college system. These are areas where we know we have workforce needs, so we're trying to incentivize students by giving them additional dollars to go into these areas of study to receive their certificate or diploma. That program is a couple years old. Next, we have the HOPE GED grant. This is just a $500 grant for students who go and get their GED through TCSG. They can turn around and use it for educational costs. The idea is to incentivize them to continue their post-secondary education. Real quick, just looking at the numbers today. So this is the fiscal year that we just finished out, FY 2015. We spent $575 million on the HOPE programs. As you can see, the scholarship programs, HOPE and Zell, represented the largest number of the largest percentage of those programs. The reforms, just to review with you very quickly, five major things were done in the reforms. First, the HOPE award amount was decoupled from tuition and a standard factor rate was established. That award chart that I showed you earlier will help you understand what that means. Book and fee payments were eliminated. The book and fee payments were frozen in the 2004 reforms and then completely eliminated in the 2011 reforms. A 7-year time limit was placed on eligibility, so any student who has taken the award after the reforms are done, after July 1st, 2011, has 7 years from when they graduate from high school to complete the award, to take the award. Rigor requirements were added. This is the first year of the rigor requirements. They have to take 2 classes that we deem rigorous, which means they have to be AP, dual enrollment, or IB classes. And then finally, of course, the Zell Miller Scholarship was created to cover full tuition for students who meet that higher standard that I mentioned earlier. Important to understand the factor rate. The factor rate, put simply, is the percent that HOPE is paying currently as it relates to the previous year. So we can go through the factor rate since the program started, since the reform started. In FY11, before the reforms, HOPE paid full tuition. In FY12, the factor rate was set at 90%, which means that HOPE was paying 90% of FY11 tuition. In FY13, it went to 100%, which means it was paying the same amount as the previous year. And then in the last 3 fiscal years, it's been 103. So we've actually seen the HOPE rate increase 3% each of the last 3 years. And that's helpful and relative as I hand it over to Mark, who's going to take a look at the impact on the cost and also on the students. And I'll do that now.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So we want to just show you a little bit about students and dollars before and after these reforms. This chart shows number of students, both for the HOPE scholarship programs and the HOPE grant programs. And just keep in mind when I'm saying HOPE scholarship programs, I'm talking about the HOPE scholarship and the Zell Miller scholarship. And for the grant programs, it's the combination of the HOPE grant, the Zell Miller grant, and the Strategic Industries grants. What you see is basically from the beginning, from the inception up through 2004, we've seen general increase in the number of students that are being benefiting from these programs. In 2004, that leveled off a little bit, and in 2007, we started seeing an increase in the number of students. Most predominantly, or the largest standout, are the number of students that were at under the HOPE grant. There are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind with this. The green vertical bar is where the 2011 reforms went into place. Now, this is the number of HOPE scholarship recipients and HOPE grant recipients. There's another thing that was happening at about the same time as that green vertical bar, and the 4 years leading up to that and the 4 years after that, that's the economic downturn and the economic recovery. One of the things that we've seen with this is that in the economic downturn, people really wanted to help improve their employability, and what that translated into is a lot of folks were going into programs, certificate and diploma programs, to help improve their employability. That's what was leading up to 2011, and then after 2011, as the economy recovered, we've seen that that line drop off. And that line has sort of followed what has happened with the unemployment rate. In 2011, it was a little over 10%, and as of July of this year, it was down to about 6%. Now, the reforms that were put into place did have an effect. They did have an effect. Everything that we're going to see here in terms of the number of students could not be attributed solely to those reforms. So we just want to make sure that that's kept in mind as we move forward. Next, let's look just at the Hope Scholarship. The blue line is what we saw a moment ago. That's the number of students being served by the program. The pink line are the dollars that were awarded to those students. From inception, you can see that the dollars have increased steadily up to about 2007, and there was a sharp increase in the number of dollars leading up to the reforms. Again, that vertical bar is where the reform went into place. You can see that the dollars were growing at a higher rate than the students, the number of students were growing. At the peak in 2011, there were $535 million paid out to Hope Scholarship recipients. In 2012, the first year of the reforms, that dropped back to $435 million. Over the last several years, you can see that the number of dollars is again rising at a higher rate than the number of students is rising. And in 2015, Hope Scholarship students, which included Zell Miller scholars, $492 million were paid out to those for those students. This is again looking just at the Hope Scholarship and Zell Miller Scholarship students. This is a direct comparison of 2012 to 2015. On the left side, you see the two bars that are the students. If you look at the total number of students, the height of those bars with the blue and the orange combined, you'll see that in 2015, we're serving about the same number of students as we served in 2012. The right two bars show the dollars that were awarded for those students. You can see that in 2015, we have a much higher amount of dollars that we have paid out for those students. You can see that this is largely attributable to the to the Zell Miller Scholarship. And again, for the Zell Miller Scholarship, for public institutions, it pays 100% of tuition. Now, an important thing about the two left bars, even though for FY15, the blue bar is shorter than the blue bar in 2012, it's important to know that we're not serving fewer Hope Scholar students. What that is really showing is that in 2011, before the Zell Miller Scholarship, a student with a 4.0 GPA was a Hope Scholar. In 2012, when the reforms went into place, it introduced the Zell Miller Scholarship. That Zell Miller student is the 4.0 student. So in a way, the Zell Miller Scholars are a subset of the Hope program, of the Hope Scholar program. So we just didn't want you to think that we're reducing the number of Hope Scholarship recipients. When you take those two combined together, from 2012 to this past year, we served basically about the same number of students. If we now look at the number of students and the dollars for the Hope Grant program, we talked a moment ago about those large increases leading up to 2011 and then the subsequent drop-off after that. You can see that the pattern that we're seeing, the students and the dollars are basically following that same pattern. In the previous slide, we saw that for the Hope Scholarship dollars, the Hope Scholarship dollars were increasing at a higher rate again now. That's attributable to the Zell Miller Scholarship. For the Hope Grant program, we do now have a Zell Miller grant, which does pay full tuition for those students, but that program was not introduced until this past year. So we've not had a chance to see the impact in terms of dollars that the Zell Miller grant is going to show. But we do anticipate an uptick in the number of dollars as a result of that program. So a minute ago, Tricia mentioned the factor rate and tuition. What we'd like to show right now, or to talk about, is a hypothetical example so that we can get a feel for the relationship between tuition and the factor rate. So in 2011, Hope paid full tuition. After the reforms and the decoupling with tuition, the factor rate was set at 90%. So for that year, Hope paid 90% of tuition. If the factor rate, or the rate at which we're increasing the Hope amount paid out, if that increases 3% a year, we're paying out more dollars each year as a result of that factor rate showing an increase. If tuition increases at the same, then we're going to be paying out the same percentage. If tuition increases at a rate higher than the factor rate, that's where we have a divergence between tuition and the percent of tuition that Hope covers. So from this hypothetical example, you can see that in year one, Hope was paying 90%. After a couple of years, if the growth, the factor rate is at 3% and the tuition is at 6%, after a couple of years of that, Hope would be paying 85% of tuition. Even though we're paying out more Hope dollars in terms of a larger Hope award, by the time we get to a year 5, the Hope would pay 71% of tuition. So this is just a hypothetical example to get a better feel for the relationship between the factor rate and tuition rate and how that can determine the percent of tuition that Hope covers. Your next set of slides are basically showing the Hope award amount and the tuition amount at the USG institutions. And we're showing these average at the sector level. And so the first slide that we have up are for our research institutions. And we can see, again, in 2011, Hope paid 100%. Then, with the reforms, the factor rate was set at 90%. So that's where the two lines begin to diverge. So the green line is what Hope pays, the dollar amount. The red line is tuition. And the vertical bars represent the difference between Hope and tuition. Yes, this is per semester, and it's figuring a full course load of 15 credit hours. So from this, and this shows FY16. So these are the tuition rates and the Hope award amounts per semester for a full 15-hour credit load. And basically you'll see that tuition, this is average tuition across the research institutions, was around $4,500, and Hope was paying out about $3,500. So there's a $1,000 difference in terms of what Hope pays versus tuition. And that's about 77% of tuition. For the regional institutions, the state universities, and the state colleges, you'll see that the pattern looks very similar across all of those sectors. And for the regional universities, there's about a $345 difference between what Hope pays versus tuition. If we move on and look at the state universities, the difference is smaller. It's about $329 in terms of the difference between the amount that Hope pays versus tuition. And finally, for the state colleges, there it's a little under $200 difference. For the regional universities, the state universities, and the state colleges, Hope pays, on average, about 87% of the tuition for those institutions, or for those sectors, excuse me. And that's all average per semester. So now we can turn and look at the Hope Grant program. And again, this is the Hope Grant, the Zell Miller Grant, and the Strategic Industries Workforce Development Grants. This slide shows the Hope pay amounts, the Hope award amounts, the tuition rates, and it adds in the Strategic Industries Workforce Development Grant amounts. So the blue line that you see here is tuition. The burgundy bars show the amount that Hope pays or has paid each year. Following the reform, the initial dip was the 90% factor rate. Then after that, you can see that those vertical bars, the burgundy bars, are showing over the last 3 years a 3% growth in the award amount each year. As Tricia mentioned earlier, those students that are in one of those 10 industry areas that are high need, where there are 141 programs within these institutions, those students would earn the Strategic Industries Grant, and that is on top of their Hope Grant award. So for those students in those industries, that award amount would actually exceed the amount of tuition. That's permissible under the laws and under regulations. It's just that the amount awarded to the student between these two programs cannot exceed the total cost of attendance. So for those students receiving one of those Strategic Industries grants on top of the Hope Grant, that means that those students can use those dollars for things like mandatory fees and books and supplies. With the grant program, now we have the Zell Miller Grant. Last year was the first year for it. It does cover full tuition for attendance at institutions where the students can get certificates and diplomas. And like with the Hope Grant, students in those Strategic Industries areas can get the Strategic Industries Grant on top of their Zell Grant. So these students could also, their total award amount can exceed the cost of tuition, but not to exceed the total cost of attendance. One last slide. This is with the Hope Grant program, just to show you how the dollars have changed over the last several years. In 2012, for the entire program, it was almost $93 million in the program. FY13 was the lowest year, and then since then we have seen growth in the terms of the dollars that have been awarded to students receiving these grants. You can see for FY14 the addition of the orange bar. That is the Strategic Industries Workforce Development Grants. In its first year, that was about $4.7 million. From the first year to the second year, the state expanded the list of industries that were covered under this to meet those workforce needs. And in FY15, it was almost $9 million that we paid out for students in those areas. Also, in that far right bar, there's the gray area. That represents the awards to the Zell Miller Grant students. And in its first year, we awarded $17.6 million for those Zell Miller Grant students. As we mentioned before, with the addition of the Zell Miller Grant, we're not taking away Hope Grant students. The Zell Miller Grants should still be thought of as a subset of the whole program students. So from what this shows is over the last 3 years, we've been paying out more dollars for these students. And that's just a little bit about before the reforms and after the reforms.
That concludes the presentation. We opted not to do projections, and I'll tell you why. It's very difficult to make projections. It's based on tuition, it's based on enrollment, and probably most importantly, it's based on lottery revenue. So, I mean, I think we can say this. The reforms had their intended impact. You saw costs decrease significantly in FY12 and FY13. Since then, in 14 and 15, so it was at a low of $500 million in FY13. Since then, the last 2 years, you've seen the program grow to $575 million last year. So, barring any unforeseen things that could happen, and there are plenty, we do anticipate the program to continue to grow. So, we were happy to take any questions.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Chastain, this is going to predate you on there. In fact, it may be in about the time you were getting HOPE that this occurred. But I asked the question, Mr. Chairman, because clearly people will get, as they did when the changes were made to HOPE, of how did we get in this situation? How did the lottery, if you will, where the reserves go and so forth. I'm looking at a slide that comes off your website, and it's 94 to 2012. That shows in 1995 the lottery spent about $500 million, but your slide has it just over 100 or so thousand on the distributions to the scholarship, because it was just starting up, and I may have misspoke in 95, okay, not 2005. So can you tell just briefly, and Chairman may want to go into that detail, but early on in the HOPE scholarship, monies were used in some places for some capital improvements outside the HOPE scholarship and outside of pre-K. Can you comment briefly on that and to the extent of the amounts of money that were spent? Because that's how we got in a position where we're looking for, that's one of the reasons, in my opinion, we're in a position where we're looking at other sources. If that money had been socked away, if you will, we would have it to play with.
I can't
or spend.
I can't comment on amounts, although I'm happy to get that to you. But there was a provision in the original lottery legislation that allowed for lottery funds to be used for technological enhancements in K through 12 education, and that was done for several years. I don't know that I have noted when we stopped doing that. It's been many years ago.
Many years ago, sure.
But but I'm happy to get exact details of how much was spent for you.
And perhaps Chairman Smyrie might remember, and I'll leave it at that if we can just get that. But I just think that's important, Mr. Chairman, because people are going to wonder how we got to the point that we needed that. And I think there were hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the GPB building, I think, over there on 14th Street. I think hundreds of millions were spent on that facility, if I'm not mistaken, that were perfectly within the letters of the law, but when money was plentiful, and now we're in a position where we're looking for revenue sources. So if you could get us that information, I think it might be valuable to the committee as we go down the line.
I do have another staff person in the audience who told me it was within the first 3 years of the lottery it was stopped. So.
But it was significant money.
It was significant, and we will get it. Yeah.
There were revenues coming in, and there wasn't enough HOPE scholars. So now we have plenty of HOPE scholars. We don't have enough money, and that just goes to the reason how we got here.
Okay.
So Mike 11, is that Speaker Pro Tem?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to ask a question. I'm not an official member of this committee, but I did have wanted to see if you had anything different than what I wanted to mention, a concern I have. I remember in 2012 in representing the House on changing how we distributed HOPE, the goal was to assure that the demands on lottery would equal or be less than the amount of dollars that came into the lottery. Mm-hmm. And then the question became, well, how would we distribute those funds equitably? And the idea that, or the concept that we, between the Senate and the House and the governor, concluded was we wanted it to be equitably among our institutions, because institutions represents students, our constituents. So whether you lived in South Georgia and went to a South Georgia college, or lived in South Georgia and went to a North Georgia college, wherever you went, it continued to be an equitable distribution of those students. My concern is that unintentionally we have perpetuated something that is compounding yearly an inequitable distribution among students, because we artificially, and I do believe unintentionally, tied it to a single point in time with the assumption that the increases in tuition rates would be somewhat similar. Well, they've been very different. And so the effect is that now, I'll just use an example, if a student from, say, my district in North Fulton attends South Georgia State College, Hope Scholarship will reimburse them for 88% of their tuition. If that same student decides that they don't want to go to South Georgia State College but choose to go to a technical college, it will only pay 75% of their tuition. And gosh forbid they want to go to Georgia Tech, it will only pay 71%. But if you look at the first year, it was 87, or I don't know the difference between the 87 and 90%. It was 80, according to your chart, it was 87% regardless of what institution you attended. And we appear to be disadvantaging the students, all of our constituents, that want to attend, number one, a research university because they've had higher than average tuition increases. But perversely, the same is true if those same constituents want to go to Middle Georgia State College, Atlanta Metropolitan State College, or Georgia Gwinnett College. And it greatly concerns me, because that diversity in terms of the reimbursement rate is compounding dramatically each year. For example, at Georgia Tech, it will be 4% less this year. Students at Georgia Tech will have their tuition reimbursed than last year. The same is true at Georgia University of Georgia. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the relationship between the tuition increases among the colleges is a separate discussion. Our constituents collectively are being, well, frankly, if they can go to one of our research universities, they're being told you might want to look at another college in another state, because some of those students have the most opportunities for scholarships at other colleges in other states. I just was curious if you had any response or comment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I certainly acknowledge that that's what's happened, that the award amounts are all over the map a little bit because they were tied to FY11 tuition. Now, the reason you mentioned that it's 87%, so the first awards were in FY12, but they were still tied to 2011 tuition. So it was 90% of the previous year's tuition.
But it was 87% of that year's tuition.
Right.
Okay.
So that's what the reforms have been tied to. And I put Mark's slide back up because I do think it shows that the HOPE award does increase or stay the same across the board equally for everyone. But as tuition changes, at different universities at different rates, at different colleges at different rates, that makes the actual award as a percent of tuition very different. Another example is Macon State College, which merged and now is Macon State University. It has changed sectors. It's changed missions. It has a broader mission, and that is not reflected in their, and because of that, their tuition has gone up probably quicker than it would have otherwise, and you can see that in their award rate relative to other schools. I think they're at 82%, and most of the schools are around 87 besides the research universities. So I'd certainly acknowledge that there is, there's not a consistent across the board percentage for every student, no matter where they attend.
And I appreciate you bringing up that point, because the way we tied it to a arbitrary single point in time, it doesn't accommodate a change in mission. So if a junior college, if we decide that, or the regents decide that a junior college should become a four-year college or vice versa, they're still artificially tied to the differences among the colleges in 11, whereas had we I don't think we could have anticipated this at the time. Had we tied it to the previous year's tuition rate, you'd still make sure that the demands on lottery would reflect what the dollars in the lottery, but you wouldn't have these disparities for students depending on where they choose to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Smyrie?
I just want to follow up on what the Speaker Pro Tem's line of thought there. If the factor of the rate factor is going up, but the curve on the tuition is spiked at a higher percentage, at what point? Where's the break point? In other words, how do you meet that demand? Do we have to keep the revenue of Hope exponentially? We have to grow it more to create a bigger fund bucket. How do we attack this? Because if the factor rate is at 103 now, and what's the actual percentage going to the average student that's getting the scholarship? What percentage is that?
As a percent of tuition?
Yes.
It depends on where they're going.
I see. Okay.
For a research university, it's about 77% of tuition, and for state universities, state colleges, is about 87% at this point.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
The issue is how they're reimbursed based on what we tied it to. The factor rate is just I don't know how to describe it, but the factor rate is a factor rate based on a 2011 tuition.
Mm-hmm.
You would have the same factor rate if you tied their increases based on what their tuition was last year. It would just be it might be a different factor rate, but
right.
I don't.
Well, Madam Speaker,
the issue is not the factor rate. The issue is that their tuition reimbursement is based on what their tuition was in 2011, which may not be what it is.
It's all a factor of the original award amount after the reforms, which is 2011.
The aggregate.
Right.
But the initial part, we had Hope paid at full tuition.
Mm-hmm.
Categorically, we've done some damage. We reduced the Christmas tree. We didn't put all the ornaments on it like we did in '89. We put presents under the tree, ornaments on it, and a star on top. And that's what the problem was. We had the Lamborghini in 1992, and the model has changed. But at the same time, when we went to the factor rate and we said we're going to pay 90% of tuition, that was not 90% of the tuition, because we're not paying it 90%.
Mm-hmm.
When we debated it, it was okay. We're going from 100% to 90%. Is that a true or not?
That's true. In the first year, it was supposed to be 90% of the previous year's tuition. But then every year thereafter, it's based on the revenue of the lottery, and that's taken into account, and it's increased. And in the last 3 years, it has gone up 3% each year, but it's just not keeping up with tuition.
Okay, that's. Thank you very much. That's good.
Not in all instances, but in certainly in several. And do you mind if on average, if you look at the university system, their tuition last year, I think on average it was about a 3% increase. So it is important to, there are huge variances within the university systems in terms of tuition increases. So on average, it might have kept up last year.
It was a little less. Tuition went up a little less.
It was actually 2.5% system-wide. So there are schools where the factor rate, the Hope Award actually was better this year than last year because their tuition was lower, their increase was lower than the factor rate.
Chairman Meadows?
Just to follow up on what Jan said, in our research schools, we don't have but 1, 2, 3, 4. Since 2011, they've had like a 32% increase in tuition. Your smaller schools have had 13.7. That's the ones that paid $13.93 for 2016. And I think the amount of money that we put towards that through Hope is 0.9 or 9%, and that's where your we don't have enough money. And then our research schools have got to hire professors and doctors and everything else out there, and they are getting more and more costly to get them to change schools or just start teaching. But your problem is you haven't got enough coming in, and our increases, again, the least increase we've had is 13.7%, and then it goes to a high of 38 at Georgia Tech and since 11. So you've got a gap there somewhere. We haven't got enough money, or we've got more students. So y'all can pick that out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything you said. I do want to point out that we still do have the Zell Miller scholarship that covers full tuition for, and I don't know how many students received that last year, but it's probably in here somewhere. So that does represent, there are several thousand students and a growing number that are receiving the Zell Miller scholarship and still being paid full tuition. And now we have the Zell Miller grant, so that's happening at the technical college system as well.
So this is just a galactic restatement of the obvious. So bottom line, if we want to move that 77% and move it up, go north of that, I think that's the statistic for the research universities. Either we need A, more revenue coming into the HOPE program, or B, we need to reduce costs, whether limiting enrollment, reducing payroll, building fewer buildings. Is that an accurate statement? Or no?
I would
How else
say,
can we move that percentage?
I would like, I'd prefer for the chancellor to respond to that second half, but no, I think it is.
Okay. So.
Well, I will say, we could do what you suggested, which is increase the amount of money, but we could also tie the reimbursement rate per college, not to an artificial rate in 11, pay out the same amount total in the aggregate, but tie it among the colleges to last year's tuition rate, not 2011, which means that if you went to Perimeter College, you'd get a little bit less of a reimbursement rate. You'd get a higher reimbursement rate if you went to a research university. Everyone would get the same reimbursement rate. No one would probably get 88%, but no one would either get 71%. Keep the reimbursement rate the same.
Chairman Meadows?
I'm not going to argue.
Thank you.
There are no further questions.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We are going to take about a 5-minute break. We're going to see where we are with our witnesses. We had anticipated knocking off around 4:30. I don't want to start another witness and cut them short. We've got 12 witnesses, invited witnesses, that are going to be here on our panel kind of all day tomorrow. If we can sneak one of them in now, we might, but we're going to kind of assess. So we may end up breaking for the day after we kind of figure out where we are, or we may hear from one more witness, but we'll let you know in about 5 minutes what the plan is. Thank you. All right, we're gonna hear from one more witness today, and this is based totally on the fact that he's here and he's willing. And we've got a long day tomorrow, and maybe this will get us out a few minutes early tomorrow. Pleased to introduce to the committee Whitaker Askew. He's the Vice President of Government Relations for the American Gaming Association. I heard him speak at a conference and had a really good kind of a national-based perspective on the issues surrounding all types of gaming, from lottery to casino to horse racing, and they put out an annual economic survey of the issues around gaming and as it pertains to state revenues, and we thought he'd be a really good witness to provide kind of a more broad-based macro look at the experience other states are having with these around these issues as we kind of go down the road of talking about various proposals that are pending before our legislature and have been for a number of years. Like I said, Mr. Askew is the Vice President for Government Relations for the American Gaming Association. He's worked on Capitol Hill before that for a number of years. Mr. Askew, the microphone is yours.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I'm happy to trim some time for you tomorrow, and I promise not to be too long for those in the audience, and certainly you on the dais. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I flew in from Washington, D.C. this morning, and I'm going to fly right back as soon as I can to get home to my family. As the chairman said, I'm Whitaker Askew, and I've been in the gaming industry for a little over 4 years. I joined the industry knowing very little about it, and it's been a very eye-opening, really satisfying experience for me to learn about an industry that I hope you will learn about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. The AGA is the national trade association representing the U.S. casino gaming industry that proudly contributes $240 billion annually to America's economy. It supports more than 1.7 million jobs nationwide, paying American workers $74 billion in wages, and it generates little revenue, $38 billion in tax revenues for government at the federal, state, and local levels on an annual basis. Casino gaming operates in 40 states, and when you consider lottery, video lottery terminals, pari-mutuel horse racing, all but 2 states have some form of legal gaming, all but 2. To be clear, I am not here today to advocate either way for or against gaming expansion in Georgia, as that decision will be left up to you and to your constituents. However, I am here to provide you with facts about gaming that you may not know. And instead of only hearing about the decades-old, stale myths and stereotypes about gaming that you're likely to also encounter as your committee continues its research. You may not know this, but gaming is as mainstream and popular as ever before. Last year, the AGA released national research conducted by respected bipartisan public opinion researchers Mark Mellman and Glenn Bolger, finding that nearly 90% of American voters find gaming to be an acceptable form of entertainment. An overwhelming majority of voters, 74% in fact, also affirm that casinos promote job creation. And nearly 2/3 of casino visitors leave the property to spend money at neighboring small businesses and other attractions. The research also affirms that casino visitors are a portrait of America. In fact, nearly 2 in 3, 62% of casino visitors are homeowners, and 70% are in the middle class or in the upper middle class. Almost half of casino visitors are college graduates, 16% higher than the national rate of Americans with bachelor's degrees. More than 1/3 attend religious services regularly, and 1 in 4 report that they are evangelical or born-again Christians. And further, 76% of casino goers who gamble set a budget for each visit, and oftentimes a majority are setting a budget of less than $200 each trip. My point in highlighting some of these key facts is that Americans today overwhelmingly see gaming as part of a broad spectrum of enjoyable leisure options, kind of like going to the movie theater or the Six Flags park, or the Atlanta Falcons have a Monday Night Football game tonight, or should I dare say, a Georgia Bulldog athletic event. And I say that because I graduated from the University of Tennessee, and those words are tough for me to come out here in Atlanta today. But all jokes aside, while again I am not here advocating for or against expansion of gaming, it's clear that the broad acceptance of gaming outlined by public opinion shows that casinos should not be treated any differently than other businesses. Therefore, through the work of this study committee, and as legislators ultimately determine what is best for the Peach State, it's important to keep in mind that Americans have come to understand that casinos are an important part of hundreds of communities' economic well-being throughout the country. They understand that the industry creates good-paying jobs with above-average benefits and supports countless local vendors and suppliers, and that gaming is a valuable community partner wherever the industry has a presence. Now I want to talk a little bit about casino gaming through the economic lens. The industry is unquestionably a powerful economic engine for our national economy. Our industry is helping provide a gateway to the middle class. AGA has long served as a data clearinghouse and informational resource for our industry, but we recently commissioned a significant undertaking with Oxford Economics where they drilled down into the economic and community impacts of gaming. And what we've learned is that in addition to the $240 billion in total economic impact and the 1.7 million U.S. jobs, the 200 distinct career occupations, and the $74 billion in employee income that's all supported by gaming, the industry also enables workers with diverse backgrounds, ages, and talents to succeed. And I'll give you a few examples. You'd probably be surprised to know that 45% of gaming's workforce is composed of minority employees, which is far more diverse than the U.S. national average of 33%. Women make up nearly half of the gaming industry's workforce. Gaming also employs more people with disabilities than the national average. And at a time when our younger working age demographic continues its struggle to find jobs, gaming employs a disproportionately large number of millennials. More than 1/3 of the gaming workforce is younger than 30 years of age, and the average age of a gaming employee is 39 years old. Obviously, another key factor typically associated with gaming, which is obviously what this study committee is heavily focused on, is revenue generation and how such revenue is utilized to benefit communities. As I mentioned earlier, gaming contributes $32 billion in tax revenues to local, state, and federal governments each year. While each state's governing laws look different, this revenue generally supports a wide range of public works initiatives, including education, infrastructure, public safety, general treasury funds, community investment, reinvestment, and much, much more. Of course, as I had also mentioned, today with commercial and tribal casino operations in 40 states, many are competing across the same regional market for the same pool of gaming customer. In some jurisdictions, competitive nuances even exist due to the policy regime in which certain casinos operate, particularly on the tax front. Needless to say, competition for gaming customers today is more fierce than ever before, and that obviously can have an impact on revenue. These dynamics and many others are forcing casino operators to have to adapt and implement innovative business practices to engage with their customers. But in order to successfully adapt, casino operators also need policies in place that will allow them to do so. Tax treatment is just one of these important policies. And of course, regulation is also a proud hallmark of gaming. Strong regulation is critical in continuing to ensure the integrity of our industry and its commitment to providing first-class entertainment to its patrons. At the same time, AGA believes that it's important for states to consider modern, efficient approaches to their regulatory oversight, as that too will help sustain the industry's economic strength for the long term. In fact, some are already starting to take these progressive steps with this regard. For example, New Jersey has recently made a number of important improvements to its tax and regulatory policies in an effort to support the state's gaming industry. Others are considering and/or undertaking policy enhancements as we speak as well. New York, for example, has expanded promotional marketing tax credits for casinos as a way to compete with neighboring jurisdictions. Indiana recently enacted a new law and a number of improvements to their regulatory structure, due in part to increased competition in neighboring states. You may know Indiana and some of the other states along the big river there that initiated their casinos on riverboats. They took measures to actually move them onto land. Significant step to bring populations from inside the state as opposed to just drawing around the boundaries, for example. Last summer, Delaware's legislature took an important step by approving a $10 million tax relief measure for the industry as well, to keep it sustainable for the long term. My point here is that while gaming is a hospitality entertainment industry, it's clearly much more than that. Therefore, the policy decisions made in state capitals today will unquestionably have a long-term impact on what gaming is able to generate, support, provide, and sustain in the future. While each gaming state has its own policies and regulations, AGA believes it's important that state legislators and gaming regulators continue to recognize and seek progressive, modern approaches to gaming policy to ensure that the industry can continue as a strong economic and community partner wherever casinos proudly operate. So in conclusion, I promised I would be fairly brief, and I hope that I have. I want to thank the chairman, both chairmen, as well as members on the committee for the opportunity to highlight some of these important facts about the U.S. gaming industry. I hope that as you continue your efforts, some of the information that I've provided will help you to ultimately determine what the best course of action may be to preserve the Hope Scholarship, as well as what's best for the state of Georgia. Should you need it, the EAGA would be happy to further serve as a resource of information for you and for this committee in the weeks and months ahead. And so with that, I would be happy to answer any questions you may have, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Chairman. Thank you.
Just a quick question, and a couple lights are on. I've read stories over the last, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, some regulatory and tax changes that have been made in other states, and I've seen headlines, and I guess my perception has been mostly in the Northeast, where some casinos are really struggling up there. Is that a function from the industry's perspective of market saturation up there? Is it tax rates by those individual states, or kind of a combination of a whole host of things?
Yeah, I think it probably is a combination of a whole host of things. Obviously, in some jurisdictions that have a more mature gaming market, they may already have a more competitive tax rate. At the same time, you have seen a large growth of casino gaming in the Northeast, and so I think as you're seeing these measures taken in state capitals, they are trying to make decisions that will allow their state to remain competitive in the future.
Senator Calsert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman just pointed out that there are differing tax rates in different states. Will you give us a range of what your industry faces? I think our bill before us proposes a 12% tax rate. Is there a standard, an average? Give me some idea of what other states are doing.
You know, it is a wide range, to put it bluntly. You take a state like Nevada, which has 7%, I think is about the low bar for the U.S., obviously gaming being the lifeblood of the state going back decades. Then you can take a high bar, whether it be Maryland or Pennsylvania, that's in the mid-50s in terms of tax rates. And then there's everything in between, 30s, 40s. Some of them are based very differently on graduated tax rates when you hit certain thresholds, or tied to slot machine play, whatever it may be. It truly looks different, but it is absolutely a wide range. And, you know, I think, getting to the chairman's point earlier, Senator, the more growth there has been, particularly in some of those regional markets, folks who may have made decisions 5-10 years ago on tax rates are starting to say, wait a second, the industry cannot sustain this at the rate we set forth. We need to take a look at this so that we can be competitive. But it is a wide range.
What about on horse racing? We're looking at that too. What's the tax rate on that?
You know, I'm not here necessarily speaking on behalf of the parimutuel piece. I believe maybe the president of their association is going to be here tomorrow, who can speak more clearly on that. It looks a little different. However, in some states, there are racino states which have a casino aspect tied to the horse racing aspect, so that may impact things differently than just a pure parimutuel situation in another state that looks different.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you for spending the time, and sorry you have to go back to Washington. Notwithstanding, I'm sure your family will be glad to see you.
Yes, sir.
On a serious note, tell me about the tax rate. Obviously, whatever that is, whether it be 7 to 12 or whatever, is that a net number, a gross number? You heard earlier that some of the question of how much of the money is returned to where we want to go to from the lottery to ultimately get to the Hope Scholarship. So I guess my question here is, if I believe the tax rates are on your gross revenue,
gross gaming revenue. Yes.
So talk to that, because then we don't get into how you run your business and so forth. So if you could articulate that further.
Yes, sir. So the tax essentially is on the gross gaming revenue, as you touched on. In terms of where that revenue goes, that's set forth by in statute in the state legislatures. And so each state certainly looks different in terms of where the money goes. Now, the casino's job essentially is to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to generate the revenue from the business side. And then once that revenue leaves our hands, it's in your hands essentially to make sure it goes where you've set forth for it to go.
And quick follow-up, and to be clear, I apologize, my question wasn't clear. But what I wanted to get at is net versus gross. So if $100 is spent in a facility and the rate is 12%, then $12 comes toward the state to be dealt, as statutory as is provided for in statute. We don't get into, well, you made 100, but it cost you 50 to run the place, and somebody won and somebody else. It's just whatever goes in, the state gets that percentage to do as the statute says. So it's a gross revenue. There's not any questions underneath. Right. Okay. That's what I was after. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Great presentation. Thank you for being here.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about crime associated with casino gambling?
Sure.
And there's been some talk about public safety and so on. Can you address that?
I can. One of those stale myths that I alluded to has certainly been in the avenue of crime. In fact, we have research in multiple states, new and old casino markets, that show that actually over time crime tends to reduce when new casinos open up. And I'll give you a quick story that I think kind of helps to paint this. One of the newer markets in the Northeast, it's not the newest, but one of the newest is Pennsylvania. And I'm not sure if you know Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It's an old steel town. The town was dead because the steel had moved out, and the decisions were made to allow a casino license to go there. And I think there was some concern about crime in that venue. And actually 5 years later, last year, was the 5-year anniversary of that market, and the police chief is saying, actually, these guys have been great to work with because they bring in their own security operations, and crime has gone down. And you can look at educational studies, whether that be in Indiana or Pennsylvania or Maryland or elsewhere, and the same trends have applied. And so we've really not seen the spike in crime that I think a lot of those opposed to casinos like to say takes place. The research is just not there to support that.
I got another question, please. Can you also touch on non-gaming revenue? I know a lot of these casinos are doing restaurants and retail and kind of an experience, if you will.
Right.
And also, have shows where they have a 3,000-seat arena to have Celine Dion or Cirque du Soleil or whatnot. And I've been told that some of the non-revenue is about as much as the revenue from the gaming, which would also help us from a tax standpoint. Can you tell us a little bit about the non-revenue part of the casino?
I can, yes, sir. So it depends on the market. So I think a lot of the things you just outlined, and actually the examples you just gave they sounded Las Vegas to me with Celine Dion and Cirque du Soleil. Obviously there, because it is an entertainment capital of the world, self-proclaimed or otherwise, they have so many other things, conventions and so forth there, where I think you're seeing the non-gaming revenue there significantly increase over the last 10 to 15 years to help balance out the overall revenue for casinos. You look at some of the regional markets, and again, depending on where the states are and what the laws allow, you've started to see some of that same non-gaming entertainment, restaurants, shopping, golf, whatever it may be, also come to what may have historically just been a casino resort. When you add the hotel component, then that brings the ability for conventions to come in, and then you certainly add the restaurants and the shows and all the other things, the amenities that come with so many of our casino resorts, then obviously it's going to have an impact that spills out to the broader community. And that's a model that's been growing significantly, even in the regional markets, for casino gaming over the last 5 to 10 years for sure. And I think that's only going to continue to grow.
Thank you.
Chairman Maxwell.
Thank you for being here today, sir. And I've been sitting here trying to study how to ask this question, but you mentioned New Jersey a while ago, and all the different regional areas that are starting gaming, I guess, or have gaming. But there's been a lot of stuff going on in New Jersey from what I can remember. Didn't they have like $1 billion casino or huge casino they'd built that never got opened, and they've just had all kind of issues up there with their casinos. And you mentioned is the state has lowered their tax rate on the casinos there. Is that what you said a while ago?
No, that was New York on promotional tax credits.
Okay.
New Jersey has started to take measures in the tax and regulatory to try to make their market more competitive. And I'm happy to talk about that if that's what you're.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out what happened in New Jersey, because at one time that was a real boom town
Sure.
for gaming, I think. And from what I've read and heard in that, I can't remember the name of that big, wasn't it in New Jersey, the $1 billion
Yes,
hotel casino complex that never got off the ground?
So Atlantic City is a very interesting research assignment, obviously. I think it's kind of the perfect storm of things, quite frankly. When you look at the expansion that's taken place, from a convenience perspective, Atlantic City, I think, suffered to a degree from there now being 5 casinos within 25 miles of downtown Philadelphia, which used to be a big influx of folks going over to the beach. And then now you have casino gaming in New York, as well as Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island. And so there's a wall of gaming that has taken shape that, quite frankly, is more convenient and newer and fresher than what Atlantic City, kind of had a monopoly on the East Coast for several decades. So that's one piece. I think the other piece is modernization. And obviously, as I mentioned, as states look at what their statutes and their regulations are, some of the other states around them, might have put themselves at a competitive advantage. And so New Jersey's now trying to see, well, what can we do to get that advantage we once had? At the same time, I think casinos have an obligation to reinvest into the community and to their facilities to attract the customers. And I think all those things are happening. The market had a good number of casinos. That number has been reduced by a few over the last year or so. And actually, if you look at the numbers now from a gross gaming revenue perspective, they're actually back on the uptick. And so, credit to them for trying to be competitive, but it's a perfect storm, I think, that hit them, and it caught them a little flat-footed, I believe.
Okay, thank
you. Is that you, Chairman Stevens?
No, me.
Oh, go ahead, Senator. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you just talk about the difference between a destination casino and a regional casino, and how what their target customer base is? And then number 2, have you done any research to determine what would be the best scale for Georgia as far as having more than one destination casino, or how many regional casinos and things of that nature?
Well, I'll answer your second question first, if that's okay, Senator. I'm not here advocating for or against casino gaming in Georgia, and I want to make that clear. And so, I'm not going to be able to stand up here and suggest to you what's the best model for you guys ultimately to determine. And so, I wish I could, but that's not the situation that I'm here to represent. In terms of your first question and the destination versus regional, obviously, as I mentioned. Think of the Las Vegas model in terms of being, the convention leader and the shows and all the other things there. That's your typical baseline foundation for a destination casino resort. And as the last 20 years have unfolded, and as many states have moved forward with casino gaming, many of the regional markets started with just a casino facility that services their locals market. Because there really was not the draw necessarily to try to bring in those conventions and those travelers, business or for pleasure, families or whatever it may be. But I do think that you're starting to see that trend change. And again, it depends on the market. But as the influx of non-gaming revenue is a good business model, and because there is demand from Americans across the country, regional or otherwise, you're going to see that trend continue to grow, because at the end of the day, casinos, regional or otherwise, want to offer the absolute first-class entertainment experience that their customers want. And so you're going to see them continue to take those measures in order to be attractive, to get folks into the door and have a first-class entertainment experience, even in the regional markets.
Representative Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Askew, was still a question the chairman had earlier to another person testifying. Have you ever looked at any studies as to how a new casino industry come into a state with existing lottery affects that lottery? And to add to that, how it could also affect existing hotel or convention industry in that market as well?
Sure. And I'm glad you asked that, and I wanted to respond to that question when you asked it a few hours ago. So, we've found over considerable time, whether it's a new state where a casino comes in or an existing state where lottery and casinos have coexisted for years, that really the demographics of the lottery player and the demographics of your casino player look quite different. And so there really, to our research, has not been significant, if any, cannibalization. And in fact, they can be complementary to one another. And so I appreciate the president of the lottery earlier for allowing others to talk about that, for you asking the question, because we've not seen negative impact on lottery from casino operations.
If I may follow up on that, what states should we look at? What states has this happened in the last several years?
Well, the most recent state would be Ohio. Massachusetts is the newest commercial casino state, but they're not operational yet. They will be the 24th state with commercial casinos once they open up. Maryland is a newer market. All of these have lotteries, obviously. New York is actually in the process of expanding their casino operation. And, from looking at the presentations earlier, Massachusetts and New York, along with Georgia, were very high on that list. So I think those are states you can look at, but not limited to that. I'm sorry I did not answer your question on the hotel piece, and I will. I think similar to the story I outlined for the chairman in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, we've seen the same thing. Local small business folks, whether it's restaurateurs or hoteliers, at first they're saying, oh, they're going to hurt our business. This can't happen. And then you fast forward, and actually those same restaurateurs and hoteliers say, you know what, our reservations are packed, exponentially so. And so we've really not seen that negative impact on the small business front either.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman Martin.
Real quick, I know we're getting late into the hour, but about the mix of games that would require human intervention, I guess dealer games versus an automated game. I guess it depends on what the market requires, and the goal here, if this were to come forward, is about the revenue it would provide. But just from an economic perspective, can you give us any anecdotal information about how that mix usually works, where those folks come from? Are they typically trained here? Or are they people that move from another state to,
in terms of employees?
Yeah, to take the job. I mean, I'm just sure there's people that are going to be interested about, okay,
sure,
so it's going to create X jobs. Do you find that, those are hired from here, or some come from other places? Do you have any information as to how that may come
sure
about should this go forward?
In terms of, each state's going to look different, but I think by and large, certainly in the new markets that are looming, I think casino operations that come in and are given the privilege of a license, sometimes it's mandated, but at minimum they try to hire at a very high threshold level local folks into the facility. They can do all the training necessary without having to bring in folks who may be trained from another state to do that. So I think that's a big, heavy emphasis of that I think makes our casino or our industry pretty special is they do this from inside, and it starts from literally the first nail into the wall in terms of building the facility, and it goes to once the facility is built and operational. As I mentioned, there are roughly 200 distinct career opportunities and occupations in your average casino facility, and that ranges from accounting to obviously operations on a casino floor to security and surveillance, which then brings in engineering. Georgia Tech's one of the finest institutions down the road for engineering. And so there is a litany of different opportunities for local folks to put their talents to use and be hired. And we see that in most jurisdictions across the country.
Well, no more lights. Thanks for your presentation.
Yes,
enjoy your time in Georgia, and safe travels back to D.C.
Thank you very much.
We'll see everybody at 9:30 tomorrow.